Imagine a war. Not a war fought over a river, a fertile valley, or a gold mine. Imagine a war fought over a ghost. A war fought over a story. Millions of people marching across continents, burning cities, and sacrificing their own lives, all to defend a narrative that cannot be touched, weighed, or proven. It sounds almost like a science fiction concept, yet this is the defining feature of human history. We are the only species on Earth that will eagerly destroy itself over a metaphor. Today, we are diving into a deeply uncomfortable but necessary question. How did the myths that originally helped our ancestors survive turn into the absolute doctrines that drive our deadliest conflicts? And more importantly, if we are wired to believe, are we doomed to fight? It is a profound paradox. If you look at human history from a purely biological standpoint, our ability to invent and believe in fictions is our greatest superpower. Before science, before written law, early humans were thrust into a terrifying, chaotic world. A lightning strike could burn down your forest. A drought could starve your family. Myth was our very first operating system. It was a framework that organized the chaos. It told early humans why the sun rose, who belonged to the tribe, and what the rules of survival were. Myths were not just campfire entertainment. They were the glue that allowed 50 strangers to cooperate. So it was essentially a survival mechanism. It provided a shared reality. If you and I both believe the mountain spirit demands we share our food, we are less likely to kill each other over a scrap of meat. Exactly. Shared belief breeds trust, and trust breeds cooperation. But there is a very dark flip side to that evolutionary coin. The exact same mechanism that bonds the in-group inherently alienates the out-group. If our shared myth is what makes us human, then the people across the river who worship a different mountain spirit are not just strangers. They are an existential threat to our reality. That makes sense in a primitive setting. But at some point, these survival stories morphed into something much more rigid. A campfire story about a mountain spirit is one thing, but a global doctrine that demands the absolute submission of all people is another. How did we get from myth to absolute truth? The shift happens when societies scale up. When humans transitioned from small nomadic tribes to massive agricultural empires, the myths had to scale with them. You can manage 50 people with a loose story, but to manage 5 million people, you need a doctrine. You need an institution. The myth hardens into dogma. And this is the critical transition point, the invention of the sacred. Once a belief system claims to hold the absolute, undeniable truth of the universe, it creates a rigid binary. There is the true and the false, the believer and the infidel, the sacred and the profane. And binaries are inherently dangerous because they completely eliminate nuance. If I hold the absolute truth of the cosmos and you disagree with me, you are not just mistaken. You are an agent of chaos. You are evil. Precisely. And when identity is entirely tied to an absolute belief, disagreement is no longer just a difference of opinion. It is processed by the brain as a physical attack. Neuroscientists have actually looked at what happens in the brain when a person's deeply held political or religious beliefs are challenged. The amygdala, the part of the brain that processes physical threats and fear, lights up. Your brain reacts to a conflicting idea, the exact same way it reacts to a predator jumping out of the bushes. That is terrifying. It means that when we are arguing over a belief, our biology is preparing us for physical combat. It is. And this leads us to the most dangerous concept in human history, the sacralization of violence. In a normal, secular conflict, war is strategic. You fight over a piece of land, and there is a cost-benefit analysis. If the cost of fighting becomes too high, you negotiate, you sign a treaty. But when violence becomes sacred, that cost-benefit analysis vanishes. Because how can you negotiate with the divine? You cannot compromise on absolute truth. Exactly. When a war is framed as a divine duty, a path to salvation, or a cosmic battle between good and evil, violence is no longer an unfortunate political tool. It becomes a moral imperative. You are not just killing an enemy, you are cleansing the world. And when suffering and death are framed as a ticket to paradise, people will endure and inflict unimaginable horrors. The belief system becomes completely immune to logic, reason, or empathy. It is like playing a game of chess where one player believes that losing a pawn will literally send them to eternal torment. They will flip the board, burn the room down, and feel entirely righteous while doing it. That is a perfect analogy. And history is drenched in the blood of people who felt entirely righteous. We see it across continents and centuries. Land is no longer just dirt and rock. It becomes the Holy Land. Victory is no longer just a political win. It is the fulfillment of destiny. But let me play devil's advocate here. Are these conflicts really about belief? Or is belief just a convenient costume that power wears? It seems like kings, emperors, and politicians have historically used these sacred narratives to justify wars that were actually about wealth, resources, and control. You are hitting on a crucial dynamic. Belief and power are a symbiotic relationship. Belief alone might not start a war, but power needs legitimacy. If a king says, "I want to invade our neighbors so I can take their gold and get richer," the peasants are not going to eagerly march to their deaths for that. But if the king says, "We are the chosen people, and it is our divine destiny to bring light to the savages across the border," suddenly you have an army of willing martyrs. Myth provides the ultimate blank check for power. It is the ultimate manipulation of our evolutionary wiring. The leaders pull the levers of our ancient tribal instincts. They trigger our need for certainty, our desire to belong, and our fear of the outsider. And they do it by monopolizing meaning. When an institution controls the sacred narrative, questioning the war is no longer just political dissent. It becomes spiritual treason. If you speak out against the violence, you are excommunicated. You are cast out of the tribe. For an inherently social species like humans, being cast out of the tribe is a fate worse than death. So, the vast majority of people fall in line, not necessarily because they are inherently violent, but because the psychological cost of defying the sacred narrative is too high. This raises a really uncomfortable question about the present day. We like to think of ourselves as modern, rational, and enlightened. We have smartphones, we have sequenced the human genome, we have sent rovers to Mars. Have we actually outgrown this, or have we just changed the vocabulary? We have absolutely not outgrown it. The architecture of the human mind is exactly the same as it was 10,000 years ago. We have just secularized the sacred. Today, you might not hear leaders explicitly calling for a holy crusade, but listen to the political rhetoric. Listen to how nations talk about identity, borders, and political opponents. We still use the language of absolute purity and existential threat. We still frame geopolitical conflicts as a battle between the civilized world and the axis of evil. The underlying structure of the delusion remains perfectly intact, even if the context has changed. So the delusion is not necessarily a specific religious text. The delusion is the absolute certainty itself. The delusion is the belief that our group possesses the flawless lens through which to view reality, and everyone else is fundamentally broken. Exactly. From a purely scientific perspective, any belief system that cannot be empirically verified but is held as absolute truth functions as a societal delusion. Now, socially, these beliefs are very real in their consequences. They build hospitals, they inspire breathtaking art, and they foster incredible charity. But when they are weaponized politically, they become engines of mass destruction. The problem is not that humans believe in things. The problem is when belief becomes absolute, unquestionable, and tied to state power. Which brings us to the ultimate problem. If this tendency to form rigid, sacred binaries is hardwired into our evolutionary biology, how do we get rid of it? How do we break a cycle that is literally written into our DNA? It is the greatest challenge of our species. We cannot erase our biology, but we can outsmart it. The first pathway out of this trap is something called epistemic humility. Epistemic humility. Break that down for us. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know what we know. Epistemic humility is the deep, structural acceptance that human beings are flawed, biased creatures, and no single human system, religion, or political ideology possesses the absolute, final truth of the universe. It is replacing the demand for certainty with a tolerance for ambiguity. That is a tough sell. The human brain hates ambiguity. We want to know who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and exactly what happens when we die. We do. but we can train ourselves to find meaning in the search for truth rather than the possession of it. Think about the scientific method. Science is, at its core, a formalized system of epistemic humility. It is a process that assumes we are probably wrong, and we need to constantly test our ideas. If we can apply that same humility to our cultural and spiritual identities, the temperature of human conflict drops dramatically. If I believe my worldview is just my best current understanding, rather than the divine word of the cosmos, I do not need to kill you for disagreeing with me. I love that. Replacing certainty with curiosity. But what about on a structural level? Because, as we discussed, individual humility is great, but institutions of power will always try to weaponize certainty. That is why the second pathway is the absolute separation of belief and power. Historically, whenever a sacred narrative merges with political or military authority, catastrophic violence follows. Governance must be entirely secular and pluralistic. The state cannot be in the business of defining spiritual or absolute truth. It must only be in the business of managing human well-being and protecting rights. It is the firewall between the myth and the sword. Precisely. The third pathway is a radical shift in education. We currently educate populations to inherit claims. We teach them the history of their specific nation, the triumphs of their specific ancestors, and the righteousness of their specific culture. We need to educate people to evaluate claims. We need to teach cognitive psychology in middle schools. Imagine if every 12-year-old understood how their amygdala worked, how confirmation bias manipulated their thinking, and how leaders use fear to trigger tribalism. That would be a cognitive revolution. If you understand the magic trick, the magician loses his power. If you understand how your own biology is being hijacked to make you hate someone across the world, you become immune to the propaganda. Exactly. You build a psychological immune system, and that leads to the final and perhaps most important step. We do not need to destroy myth. We need to evolve it. Humans are storytelling animals. We will never survive without a shared narrative. If the old myths were about tribal superiority and divine conquest, the new myth must be about collective intelligence and shared human identity, moving from us versus them to just we. Yes. Think about the famous photograph taken by the Voyager 1 space probe, the pale blue dot. Looking at Earth from billions of miles away, every empire, every holy war, every dictator, and every sacred doctrine is reduced to a fraction of a pixel suspended in a sunbeam. That perspective is not just poetic. It is a new framework for survival. We are a single species, stranded on a tiny rock in a hostile universe, facing existential threats like climate change, pandemics. We can no longer afford the luxury of tribal delusions. Our interdependence must become our new sacred narrative. So the story of cooperation becomes the myth that saves us. It is fascinating to think that the very same evolutionary mechanism that made us capable of burning down a village could be the exact mechanism we use to build a global civilization. We just have to point the compass in a different direction. That is the beauty of human consciousness. We are the only species capable of looking at our own programming and deciding to rewrite the code. We can honor the stories that brought our ancestors through the dark, without allowing those same stories to burn down our future. We can choose to hold our beliefs with open hands instead of clenched fists. It really comes down to what we choose to worship. If we worship our own certainty, we will inevitably end up destroying each other. But if we can learn to revere our shared humanity, our capacity for reason, and our collective future, we might actually survive ourselves. The myths of the past gave us meaning in a chaotic world. They taught us how to stand together against the dark. But when those myths harden into absolute truths, when they are weaponized by power, they turn belief into a blade. The challenge of our time is not to abandon meaning, but to elevate it. To move past the childish comfort of absolute certainty and step into the mature, complex reality of a shared planetary existence. Because the most powerful story we can tell is no longer about who is chosen, who is right, or who has the divine mandate to conquer. The most powerful story we can tell is about how we move forward, together. If this conversation challenged you, If it made you rethink the narratives you hold sacred, do not just let it fade into the background. Question it, discuss it, because the future of humanity does not depend on the battles we win. It depends entirely on the stories we choose to believe next.